We're really very lucky to have a truly rock star panel of experts in the field. I think this is a really brilliant session because we've got an expert from the field of research, an expert from the field of philanthropy and funding, and an expert from the field of practice. And we've also got all of your lovely selves in today. So we're going to do the panel very briefly, and each of our speakers is going to give some key talking points, and then I really want to open it up to the floor to ask questions and sort of create a bit of a debate. So yeah, without further ado, I'll introduce the panel. And so we've got Dr. Sweta Shah, who is a global advisor for early childhood development at the OXSCIE Foundation. We've got Danny Labin, who is vice president at Sesame workshops, working on international projects. And we've got Tina Hyder from the OXSCIE Foundation, senior program manager. So I wanted to start with you, Sweta. I wanted you to talk to us about your experience of conducting research in refugee situations.
Yeah, so thanks. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to actually be talking about research that I did for my PhD. And I looked at South Sudanese refugees in Uganda, in the settlements of Uganda, West Nile, which is the northwest part of Uganda. And this program that I was looking at was an early learning program, so looking at services for children 3 to 6 years old that also had parenting support. So why did I pick this particular topic to research? Well, I'm a practitioner at heart. You know, I work for the Aga Khan Foundation. I've worked for many NGOs. And when I was working in the field, or still when I'm working in the field, one of the big things that I come across, or the kind of barriers, is that there's just lack of understanding on what early childhood development in humanitarian context means. And therefore, there's very little funding that goes to this area, even less than what goes to ECD in non-emergency context. So for me, as a practitioner, I was like, well, how can I contribute to actually moving the needle on that? And so I decided to do research on it to try to contribute to that. I've also found I've had kind of one foot in multiple worlds throughout my career, both looking at early childhood development and education, but then also working on the humanitarian side. So a lot of my experience, practical implementation experience, is in humanitarian context. And I just found that there's such a siloed approach, not only for sectors, but also among humanitarians and non-humanitarians. They don't really talk. And so for me, I just felt like doing research, as rigorous as I could in a refugee context could contribute to that dialogue. So what were the methods that I used? I used a quasi-experimental design, mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative. I compared program children, so children who were in these early learning services and their parents, with a control group, which was a waitlist control. So waitlist control, for those of you who don't know, it means that they haven't gotten any sort of services, but they will in the future. And that was the only way I could really do this type of research, because you can't, especially in a refugee context, say that these kids are going to get services and these are not. There's no way anyone will participate. So that's how I did it. And then I looked at the parents of the program children to particularly look at when parental awareness and skills increases, does that correlate with children's development? I'm not going to really go into my findings, because I think here I would rather point out the challenges that I faced in doing this research, because I think that's where we can get into the more meaty discussions around research. But there were a number of challenges, as you can imagine, that I faced in doing this. Most notably, and kind of very easy to understand, is issues of access and security. So in these situations, even accessing refugee children, even accessing refugee families was really challenging, and I really needed to have an agency who was on the ground, who already had access and had a relationship with communities to get access to that. Then of course there's security, because even though in Uganda and West Nile, where these refugee populations are, is fairly stable, there's still tension because they're not that far from the border of South Sudan. And there's actually a lot of movement that goes on back and forth between them. Secondly, looking at tools, and this came up earlier in the session earlier, the roundtable earlier, where we're looking at local adaptation. So just there are no tools that really have been adapted for these types of contexts at all. So before I could do any sort of research, I had to actually go through a whole process of adapting existing tools. And that meant taking so I had a child development tool that I used, the Ages and Stages questionnaire. There's so many that you could use, but I decided to choose that one only because I had access to it and I knew it. So that made it easier as a researcher. But then going through the process of adapting that took a lot of time. So if you know that tool at all, there's cognitive development. It looks at fine motor skills, gross motor skills. It looks at self-help skills, and it looks at linguistic skills. And within that, there were a lot of things I needed to change and adapt for the context. So for instance, in that tool, for fine motor skills, it says, can a child use a zipper? Can a child walk up the stairs? Well, in South Sudan, if you know South Sudanese children, most of them don't have clothes with zippers or even buttons. And you don't really see stairs in their homes. So those are certain types of developmental milestones that you can't expect those children to have. So I had to go through a whole process of actually adapting the tool, and I did that through qualitative means. So that was a real challenge. Then I had to get the right groups for the research. So as I mentioned, I had a waitlist control, but we only really finalized that control group like a week before I got to Uganda, because there's so much movement of families and children, and to find a group that actually hadn't been touched or hadn't been given any sort of services to create a comparable control took a lot of work. And I did have to look at parental education. There were a number of things I had to look at for control. So even finding that group, miraculously, we did get a good one, like a week before I got to the field for data collection. Then another challenge was I hired local refugees themselves to be the research assistants. So those who were already ECD teachers, they already knew something about child development, and so one of the things I did was we actually tested the adapted ASQ with children. And so I thought, okay, well, ECD teachers, they've already gotten some training, so they would be the best ones, and we tried carefully to select the most animated, the best of the best. I went through a whole process of training them on how to collect tools and how to do the data collection, and then we started day one, data collection. I was really psyched and excited, and then food distribution happened. So half of them left because who wants to collect data when they need to stand in line for food? So that was something I did not anticipate at all, even though I've done so much humanitarian work. I just didn't think, oh, they're just gonna leave. So then all of a sudden I have to find a whole new other that fill that gap of 50% and retrain them and send them out again. So it took a long time, as you can imagine, to do that process. And then lastly, I wanted to mention the issue of sample size, which came up in the earlier roundtables, that we need, in order for us to really have effect, to see kind of effect, if you're doing quantitative and qualitative, especially quantitative, is you need to have a large sample. And so one of the things I didn't realize, or I didn't really think through when I was doing this research, is I figured out a decent sample size, which I thought would be around 120 children for each group. But what I didn't anticipate was in the control group, some of these kids were doing these activities for the very first time. So even a simple activity like catching a ball or it was just interacting with someone they didn't know, they started crying. So obviously we were not going to continue data collection with children that are crying. So I lost a lot of kids that way. The other thing, then the opposite, was for the program children, because we actually were doing the data collection at the ECD center, other kids saw it and they said, oh, well, I want to join. And then they're bringing their parents to sign up. So I was like, I don't have enough surveys to handle this many kids. So I had both kind of dropouts and additional, which really skewed my sample. But in some ways, it was fine. It was a great learning experience. So I wanted to just briefly mention some of those challenges, just to spark our thinking. Because as we think about this research for Schools 2030, some of the countries that will be included are conflict affected or post-conflict. We likely will not look at acute emergencies for a 10-year longitudinal study, but I felt it was important to at least bring to the surface some of the challenges that could be faced when doing research for real on the ground.
So it sort of strikes me in that complex situations by the nature quite idiosyncratic, right? The sort of confluences of unforeseen forces that create certain sort of situations. So given your experience of working across multiple complex situations, what have you learned that you think could be applicable across future contexts? And how do you sort of distinguish between that and those things that remain very specific to this event?
Yeah, so I think the programming principles and the research principles remain the same. So the general principles that you need for good research and the general principles for good programming remain the same across, no matter what context. But what you really need to take time for is the adaptation to local context. And sometimes you don't anticipate that taking a lot of time, but it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of work. And to do it properly, to really adapt tools, to really set up the research so you can have a proper comparison group, I think takes much longer in these types of contexts. And I think the other thing I learned that's different from non-humanitarian contexts is you have to have you have to have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D, and a plan E, because there probably will be a number of things that get in the way of your research when you're in the field that you hadn't even imagined, and you just have to, if you have a short period of time in the field to collect data, you have to figure that out quickly. So I would say those are some.
Interesting. So Tina, the Moving Minds Alliance is sort of really active in some of the most acute emergency situations around the world. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the kind of work that you do.
It's becoming active, so the Alliance itself, I'll say a bit about that. So I'm from the Open Society Foundation's Early Childhood Programme, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Moving Minds Alliance, which is just about to launch on June the 20th, which, as many of you will know, is World Refugee Day. And the Alliance has been established this year really to help rebuild the resilience of families in crisis and emergencies to ensure the healthy development of young children. And while it was prompted by the situation in Syria, it hopes eventually to be a global initiative. We're drawing funders working in a number of different places. So why did we form? There are many donor collaboratives, and I think many of us are sort of part of a few of them. But I think for some of the reasons that Sweta mentioned, the siloed nature of early childhood in development, let alone in humanitarian contacts, the lack of funding, led a number of us to think that we would gain some strength and a greater ability to act if we could form an alliance together. The external factors are that, as we know, children and families are increasingly impacted by conflicts and crises around the world. As UNHCR reported in 2016, out of the 67 million people of concern to them, 16% of the total children under the age of 5, so that's almost 10 million people. And as those of you who are listening to radio this morning, the new UNHCR report has just launched again, and there's 68.5 million people of concern, so those numbers are likely to be rising. Drawing on what Stephanie was telling us this morning, we know that exposure to extreme forms of stress that's prolonged can really, and the stress of exposure to violence and displacement can really impact on children's development and have an effect throughout the life course. But we're also seeing more evidence, but not quite enough evidence, that interventions that bring together early learning, protection, health, nutrition, and really offer support to parents can make a difference. What we also know is that once families reach a relative place of safety, those stressors don't disappear. So post-migration stressors such as discrimination, poverty, the breakdown of social networks and family networks, learning a new language and so on can take a huge toll, and we're seeing that in some of the countries surrounding the Middle East at the moment. And although we see that basic health needs are often met in emergencies for very young children, this is a well-known fact I think that many of you will be aware of, but when there was a review of, I think, 38 humanitarian plans in 2016, only 10 of them mentioned any form of early childhood development or early learning. So for us, there was a sort of imperative to form as an alliance, and I'd be very interested in hearing how you think we can act to help move the situation forward.
Absolutely.
So we're a small alliance so far. There are only 7 of us. It's a growing alliance. I can tell you who people are if you're interested. Yes, some of you might be. And all the funders currently involved in really support interventions along the spectrum of humanitarian interventions. So those who are working in sort of early responses, so one of the foundations is supporting an intervention in Cox's Bazar at the moment, to play and learning intervention to support Rohingya and actually host communities at the moment. Others of us are working with families who are on their journeys to safety, so we've just supported the transformation of sea containers into early childhood centres on islands in Greece, which are supposed to be registration centres. They're not. People staying there a very long time. And there are people who are then sort of offering training to early childhood workers in countries where families are settling, but perhaps who haven't been used to working with refugee families or families affected by conflict. So what does this alliance aim to do? Well, I suppose the sort of the big aim is really to strengthen practice and mobilise support. And what that means is that we're interested in supporting initiatives that help us learn more about what works for which children or which contexts in emergency situations. And we're also interested in strengthening practice and what actually really happens on the ground. And that's both, and along with practice, and also the policy frameworks that enable that practice to really thrive and survive. We've got 3 main areas of immediate work. The first is to scan the existing tools that are available to support ECD in emergencies, many of which are very sector specific. So we have tools for people working in education, tools for people working in protection. We'd like to sort of scan them and then maybe commission a review that helps us within these emerging overarching holistic frameworks in early childhood. So the nurturing care framework that the WHO, World Health Organization, has launched, to see how we can really bring together and break down some of those sort of sectoral silos. We're also very keen in understanding what works and how governments and both local governments and central governments can create both the policy space but also direct funding to really provide effective interventions. So we're going to look at case studies, possibly at city level, maybe starting with Jordan. We're still discussing that. And then, with all of that, we want to advocate. And it links back to the conversation earlier today and the points that I think that people raised. Information is very useful and can help inform what we do some of the time if we have time to read it. But actually, this is about changing the amount of money and the importance of the sector in the minds of those people who actually influence the sector. So donors, particularly, we're interested in changing that 2% of humanitarian funding that's allocated to to education. Only a fraction of that goes to early childhood development. We'd like to see those figures increase. And that's it really. As I say, we launch on the 20th of June. We're interested in hearing from people in the field from many different perspectives on what you think this alliance can do. Yes, we will probably start to pool funds at some point, but at the moment we're still really trying to understand where the gaps are and what the field is telling us is needed and could be useful. A few of the thoughts that we've had so far around areas of interest for us are cost. I think somebody raised there, sort of how much interventions cost, and so therefore, if a government's going to look at a parenting program, why would I choose this one as opposed to that one? And looking also at dosage, frequency, workforce capacity, training issues, and so on. The place of host communities, which is incredibly important, and certainly for Open Society Foundations, the role of the early childhood space as a space where communities can integrate, where host communities can welcome refugee and migrant communities is incredibly important. We're interested also in tools and adapting tools that have been made for very different settings. How do you measure impact, child outcomes around parental changes in very fluid and very changing situations? We're also interested in how you draw in the local community as researchers, children's voices, but also how local communities benefit from interventions that don't just sort of arrive out of nowhere, stop after a very short funding cycle, and then disappear again. So those ideas of sustainability, whatever forms that takes, are also important. And I may stop there.
I have one question to allow you to carry on.
Okay.
So apart from money and political will, so the obvious big challenges, what do you envisage being the main barriers to the Alliance doing the work that you wanted to do? And how do you envisage getting over them? And actually, what support would you want from the academic and the sort of practitioner community?
At the moment, the barriers seem to be just about a very crowded field, and carving out ECD as the space that's sort of part of, but not completely education related, is part of, but not completely protection related. So carving out a space for early childhood development may be a barrier. I think thinking about things that often obsess many of us as donors and funders is about transition, the scale. And how much can we balance the tension between locally derived solutions and interventions that work with those much larger interventions that often can be delivered by international organisations that can make a huge difference at scale and may be helpful for governments in very key situations. So I think there's that tension between the sort of local and sort of international solutions. I think asking the right questions, basically not directing time, energy, and resources into finding out things that we know already, or trying things out, but having to hope of going to scale, having to hope of expanding, understanding, and really working in partnership with communities, not seeing the people that we want to work with as objects of pity or as not having strengths that we can build on. So.
Agreed. Thank you, Tina. So Danny, moving on, Sesame Workshops, hugely successful, global household name, and it's all because of you.
Well, thank you. I took time out of my business.
And the Oscar goes. So it'd be great if you could tell us about the organisation, the work that you've done in emergency situations, and the work that you're planning on doing in emergency situations in the future.
Okay, great. I assume everyone knows of Sesame Street on some level or another, but if anyone doesn't, we actually consider ourselves to be the world's largest informal educator. We're currently viewed in 142 countries and by 156 million children in all of those countries combined. I think the topic of uncertainty really struck me this morning, because when the presentation about VUCA and the uncertainty, and it all felt somehow like really new and something very timely for the moment. But it actually made me think about 1969, which was when Sesame Street was founded, almost 50 years ago. And it was actually a time marked by tremendous uncertainty. It was during the Civil Rights Movement, the war on poverty, and the whole concept of Sesame Street was to create an aspirational reality for young children who would be able to see themselves on screen and also learn about the diversity and the pluralism in society. And that was controversial in 1969. Actually, it was banned on television stations in the state of Mississippi for the first 2 years because on the show, well, I know it almost seems laughable now, but it it wasn't laughable then. And in some ways it shows what progress we've made, because there isn't a children's television program today that doesn't have diversity as part of its cast. But then the whole idea of having a cast with characters who spoke English and Spanish and were multiracial and who used sign language, and that was just anathema to a lot of people. So a lot's changed in the last 50 years, and we've actually learned a lot. Research is a very significant part of the Sesame Street model. And it's actually been a huge part of helping us to create local adaptations around the world. So instead of just taking Sesame Street and dubbing it, which we do in some countries, but in about 30 countries around the world, we create local Sesame Street projects, which are very resource intense, but also have proven to be the most effective in terms of learning outcomes. And we've worked in places marked by active conflict. I actually personally was based in the Middle East for 5 years working on an Israeli-Palestinian-Jordanian co-production of Sesame Street that was produced at an especially violent time in the region. And people ask all the time, like, is it effective? Was it effective? There isn't peace in the region. How can you explain yourself? So the 4-year-olds of the time haven't grown up yet, so maybe there is hope. But research has been a really huge part of our understanding how to convey positive messaging on screen and through community engagement activities. And actually one of the findings from that series, from the summative evaluation that took place, was that Israeli Jewish and Israeli Arab, as well as Palestinian and Jordanian kids who watched the show, expressed a greater willingness to engage with play with members of the other groups. And that was a very similar finding that we had with our work in Kosovo, where we had 2 versions of the program, one in Serbian, one in Albanian, where we found that 74% of children who watched from either ethnic group had more positive views of the other group than children who hadn't watched. So that was really encouraging. We've also found, I didn't prepare slides, but I do have this folder I just happen to have. So these are some of our girl Muppets from around the world. We've really made a very concerted effort in our international programs to focus on strong girl characters to promote gender equity and girls' education. One place where we're working on that actually in a very deliberate way is Afghanistan. This is Zari, the purple one. Right there. She's 6 years old, she goes to school, she wears a backpack, and she's really a model for girls' empowerment and gender equity. She was just joined last season by her little brother, Zirak, who looks up to her. And one of the exciting things that, well, a couple of exciting things that we found in the last few months, since last OXSCIE, was that both Zari and Zirak are identified without any prompting, spontaneous recognition, by 44% of all Afghan children who are in the representative sample, both in rural and urban areas. So that's just incredibly promising of the type of power that we can have with these role models, Muppets, and yet role models, or spokes Muppets. But I think one of the really encouraging things that we found actually from that same study was that parents are watching along with their kids in about half of the households. So we're also able to impact attitudes for parents. Mothers and fathers are watching the show. So that's really exciting. So in taking all of the research together and the successes that we've had, we actually have just embarked on probably the most ambitious initiative of our nearly 50-year history, which I have to give credit to some of the people on my panel, because actually about a year and a half ago or so, the Bernard Van Leer Foundation and the Open Societies Foundation provided seed funding to Sesame Workshop to work in partnership with the International Rescue Committee to look at how we could use Sesame Street in that humanitarian context for Syrian refugees and their families displaced throughout the region. And based on the pilot work that took place, and it was actually a relatively small investment. And I'm not saying that to disparage the amazing pilot work, but really because it actually in the last 6 months has exponentially by, I think, a power of 500 times, if we do the math. Turned into a $100 million grant from the MacArthur Foundation that was awarded in December. And so this will become the largest early childhood initiative in the history of humanitarian work. And the hope is that the learnings over the course of this 5-year initiative will also inform refugee and humanitarian contexts around the world, in Sudan, other places throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and also in Bangladesh with the Rohingya displacement. I actually am going from here to Bangladesh, and so we're not waiting necessarily for the results of this 5-year initiative, but I think it's also really given Sesame Street and ECD in general a lot of credibility in this space, which I think is in some ways an exciting watershed moment, I want to call it, because I think the confluence of what we know about early learning and what we learned about this morning and about toxic stress, in some ways it substantiates what people who've been working in the ECD space all along kind of knew or believed, but I think we now have the neuroscience and the developmental psychology to really support these claims and to take them forward. So it's really great to be here. And also just the whole dialogue around everything else happening, even big and furry Sesame Street. Sometimes, especially in the context of other children's programs, there is a sense that we're really alone in this big space. Because if we look at the other competition in the children's media market, there really isn't this kind of focus. So it's really encouraging to be around this whole community of practice and research and philanthropy.
Oh, yes.
Oh, is that Elmo? Oh, right. That's in New York.
That's you.
That was
Where
really
That was in our office.
Oh,
Oh, was that your office?
Oh, that was at the OSF?
We made the most of
Oh,
it.
wow,
for a special fee.
I've got a couple of questions for you, Danny, and I know you've got the video. And then I think after that we'll open it up to the floor for a serious grilling for these guys. So Danny, I'm wondering, what are the main lessons you've learned so far from your work in crisis situations that you would, so the 3 big lessons, if there's only 3, and I'm sure there are more, that for the next big humanitarian crisis, and as sad as it is, it feels like an inevitability more than a possibility. If you were to brief the head of a big humanitarian agency going in, what lessons would you give them from the work that you've done that they could take in and would improve the work that they're going to do?
I think one of the findings that we're starting to discover is that there are certain similarities between different places where conflict exists. So there are lessons to be learned from the work in the Middle East, in the Israeli-Palestinian context, and work that we've done in Northern Ireland around conflict, but that each individual conflict also has its own unique intricacies and issues to understand. So that it's really not a one-size-fits-all scenario. And yet, there are certain underlying trends. So I think the big challenge for us right now is actually trying to think about what content do we actually already have to be able to hit the ground running that would be relevant and meaningful to the Syrian refugees in the 4 countries where we're working, and what do we actually need to create? Because we know, for 50 years we've been working in early childhood education, so presumably there are segments that we can just take and dub and apply. But then even what language to dub them in, or what dialect of Arabic, and how the messaging can be meaningful both for the refugees themselves and for the host communities, which is another aspect of the work we're doing. So I think the big takeaway is that everything takes time. I really identified with the stories you were telling about just, and even the 5-year program that we're working on, which I don't know if it was officially supposed to start right after the grant came through, but we really realized that we weren't ready to start the work right away, that we really need to take time to understand these issues and also to cultivate the right partners who would be able to implement the work too.
Brilliant. Great, so we've got a video.
If we have a minute, I just thought it really sort of captures the essence of the context
I think we
specifically.
should.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
We can end the live stream.